Good morning, Dr. Winegard. Welcome to Twice Told. I'd like to start by introducing you to the concept of Twice Told. Twice Told is a platform where author and reader get to interact and exchange ideas and thoughts. The idea behind Twice Told is you, as the author, you had an idea or a set of ideas which you expressed first in your book. I formed a series of impressions and ideas when I read it. And now, when author and reader get together on a platform and discuss about it, hopefully we both end up richer. I know I will obviously be learning a lot from you, your insights into that went into this book. And that's how Twice Told. So thank you for making time for this conversation, Dr. Weingart.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start off with my first question. Why did you choose to write about this book? Why horses?
I think we as human beings are often, our hubris gets the better of us, and we think that our wonderful men and women make and shape our own history when more often than not, it's external factors that have influence and agenda on the historical trajectory of our species and of our own history. So, obviously, I've written previously about the mosquito and how mosquito borne pathogens have shaped and impacted human history. But that could be climate change, it could be other survival pressures, drought, famine. So I was wanting to write, following up on the mosquito, another book on an external factor that's often overlooked in history that had just such a profound impact on history, where if we removed it, in this case, the horse, our modern world order would look nothing the same. And that can't be said about very many factors in history, where if we remove them, our human story would be completely different. So we can say that about the mosquito, and we can certainly say that about the horse, but very few other things.
Understood. Now, could you tell us about the bone wars and what role horses had to play in this?
So the Bone Wars were the first archaeological excursions into the Western United States, which is obviously the hotbed of dinosaur bones, both in Canada, with Alberta coming south into Wyoming, Colorado, Utah. There's more dinosaur species in these areas of the world than anywhere else on the planet. So Alberta, Wyoming, Colorado have the most species of dinosaurs compared to everywhere else. So paleontology, early stages of paleontology, not just in the United States, but globally. And it was a windfall to academic immortality and certainly the financial, lucrative financial rewards that came with it. So it was essentially early paleontologists, almost really Indiana Jones type paleontologists, who this is coinciding with the American Indian Wars in this area of the United States as well. So Buffalo Bill, before he was Buffalo Bill, acted as a scout for some of these paleontologists. So it's pretty cutthroat and dangerous for the most part. And they resort to bribery and theft and violence to try to outdo each other. And some of the very first bones that are pulled out of this area are of a little tiny animal that's roughly 10 pounds called the Hyracotherium, which is the ancestor to the modern horse. So roughly 50 to 60 million years ago, this creature inhabited that area of the United States.
Understood. Now, leading up on the topic of the Hyracotherium, how is it that paleontologists then managed to excavate these fossils, but make sure I identify and categorize it under the same species as Hyracotherium, using that as an example, given communication barriers that existed then there was no internet, so how did paleontologists communicate with one another? Was there any incident where Hyracotherium was classified as some other species by mistake, which was later corrected?
Right. So the original Hyracotherium was actually found in England. So this animal expanded across the Bering Strait. Actually, at that time, you could go across the Bering Strait, but you could also travel the northern islands from Canada to Scandinavia. So you could migrate to Asia and to Europe kind of both ways from the Americas at this time. So Hyracotherium left the epicenter of equine evolution, which is Colorado, Utah, Wyoming area. It's the epicenter of horse or equine evolution. And then was a globetrotter and then died off in these other places while it continued to evolve in the epicenter of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah. So here it was called the dawn horse, if you will, in the United States, but it's a later finding, so it's known as Hyracotherium because it resembled a hyrax, which is a little gopher-like creature actually in the Middle East, a 10-pound kind of furry creature that looks like a prairie dog or a gopher. And actually, hyrax's closest relatives are elephants and manatees. I mean, evolution works in mysterious ways. So that's why it got the name Hyracotherium. So there's two studies of early equine evolution going on, one in the United States with a man named Othniel Marsh at Yale University, and another one going on in England. And it's not till later that they connected the dots that these were actually the same animals. I believe it's in the 1830s when they're like, actually, these are the same animals. But since Hyracotherium was named first in nomenclature, it is the proper name for this animal or the earliest ancestor of the horse. And so trying to figure out equine evolution, they started at the beginning with modern horse species, and using teeth and toes, they worked their way backwards through the fossil record, all the way back to Hyracotherium, which had multiple toes. And then there's actually a relative that's older, which would have had 5 toes on all feet. The Hyracotherium has 3 and 4. And these toes, given climate changes and environmental pressures, eventually became vestigial toes on the back of the horse. There's something called an ergot or a chestnut, which is that hairless spot on the back of a horse's leg that's actually a toe. And then they melded together to form one hoof, essentially, the other 3 toes. So that's how they trace, I guess, starting modern, tracing backwards through the fossil record to Hyracotherium.
Understood. Now, my next question is going to be about theology and horses in Mormon theology. How did this come about?
Sorry, say that again.
Horses in Mormon theology.
In Mormon theology, so in the Book of Mormon, it says when the prophets arrived to the Americas in the forest that they found horses, and they specifically mention these animals that the prophets. I mean, I'm not Mormon, so I'm basing this on history, not any kind of spirituality. And I'll preface it. I don't care what people believe as long as you're a good person. But so they said that when the prophets came to the Americas, that they found all these various animals, and they included horses. We know, given the time period of when this allegedly happened, that horses were extinct in the Americas as of 9,000 years ago or 7,000 BCE. And this story in the Book of Mormon happens well after that. So there's a bit of a discrepancy between the spiritual text and what we know from the archaeological record.
Understood. So, do we chalk this down to conjecture leading to coincidence?
I don't know. I'm not gonna. I mean, people can believe whatever they want. I base my beliefs on science and evidence, not on faith personally. But people can believe whatever they want.
Absolutely. I second that. And we'll continue to believe in archaeological evidence, and so be it. So let that be. Now, how do we know that Homo sapiens hunted horses and didn't necessarily scavenge them? Because I'm asking because horse meat is quite tough, and it would be quite resource intensive to tenderize that meat.
Yeah. So earlier, they're not the earliest evidence we have of humans hunting. It would be equine species, like pre-modern horse. So we're looking really with Homo habilis. We're going back millions of years. We have cut marks on now extinct equine species, which were the ancestors to modern horses and modern zebras and asses or donkeys. So currently, there's 7 equine species on the planet: 1 horse species, 3 zebra species, and 3 donkey or ass species. So they were carving up. There's cut marks, human cut marks on bones we find from roughly 2.1 million years ago in Africa, and then shortly after that in China. So we know that our ancestors were at least eating the carrion of dead equine species, if not hunting them. We have no proof that they were hunted, but they were certainly eating them, whether they were carrion or hunting them. Um, as we evolve and become modern Homo sapiens, we have, I mean, archaeological evidence, cave painting evidence. We have so much evidence of humans hunting horses, or equine species all over the world, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in Africa with zebras. So whether it's the Chevet caves, which are 32,000 years old, the Lascaux caves, which are 17,000 years old, and then obviously archaeological deposits in the Middens, where we have the bones of equine species specifically being hunted. So it was like any other animal. We hunted it for food, and I've eaten horse, and it's quite delicious. It is very high in protein, very high in iron, very high in both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which is rare in most meats. So it is an extremely healthy superfood, with its iron content, protein content being way higher than beef, as well as a bunch of vitamins plus omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. But it is extremely lean, so yes, it has to be cooked very rare. But it was delicious. I know that might be hard for some of the listeners to digest, but it's all good.
I like the choice of words. I suppose the pun was intended.
Yes.
Understood. Now, I like,
Most puns were intended. The all good part too.
got you, got you. Now, my next question is going to be about how you describe taming. Taming and domestication is two different things. But is this so similar in scope with slavery? You capture somebody, you subjugate them, and then eventually they become a part of your family, so to speak, with conditions, of course.
Well, I mean, if slavery is a very, very, very broad term. Different cultures practice various forms of what we refer to as slavery. But when we think slavery, we think African chattel slavery, which is actually a very new institution, which is very specific to predominantly the Americas and plantation colonies in the Western Hemisphere. But when we think of slavery in other cultures, it's not so much slavery where we think of that kind of ownership or subjugation or control through violence. A lot of the times it's adoption, and it's a very loose. I don't even want to call it slavery because that, again, the connotations of African chattel slavery. So I think we have to be careful when we use the term slavery, specifically what we're referring to. I would push back and say no. Most animals don't allow themselves to be domesticated because there's nothing in it for them. There's nothing we can give them that they can't or want from their normal natural habitat. So when we think of the domestication of animals, humans, because of curiosity and greed, have tried to domesticate every animal on the planet, and it just doesn't work because the animal says no. It has to be a mutual partnership. Sure, there's a little bit of kind of barnyard Stockholm syndrome, if you will, that goes into this, but it's a mutual partnership where both species are getting something they want. So, for example, the first animal to be domesticated was dogs, and dogs largely domesticated and tamed themselves. It would have been Siberian, and it's a multiple site origin of domestication for the Siberian gray wolf. They just would have hung around human caves and family or clan habitats and ate our garbage. And then eventually you get a genetic mutation, which these gray wolves become a little more docile. And then they're getting companionship from us, so a herd mentality. They're getting warmth. They're getting free food. They're getting free sexual reproduction. They don't have to work for that. It's handed to them. So they're getting all of this from us. And in a sense, we as humans mimic their pack mentality. And from our point of view, we get a hunting tool, and we get an early warning device for safety. What becomes the wolf dog will let us know when we're in danger. And we also get, I suppose, a companion and a friend and somebody to snuggle with. So that's the dog is the easiest example. And this is probably somewhere around 40,000 years ago this takes place, where both species are getting what they want out of the relationship. So it's similar for horses in different ways, but that's how we go from taming an individual animal to the domestication of a species. You can tame any individual animal, like Mike Tyson's tiger or Coco the gorilla or Hannibal's shivering elephants, but we've never domesticated elephants. We've never domesticated tigers. It's a huge step from taming an individual element of that species to fully domesticating the species. Very few animals have the pre-required package of physiological and social traits to allow themselves to be domesticated. And for horses, it's what they lack, actually, that is part of the package. They're evolved for 100% flight, not fight. They lack claws, they lack antlers or horns, they lack sharp teeth. So given their lack of defensive weapons, because they're designed for flight with their size, speed, strength, and stamina, it's a bonus for us to domesticate. And what we offer them is free food, free sex, free reproduction, and a herd mentality within a packs of domesticated horses and also ourselves. So it's a win-win. And likely the horse would be extinct if not for humans reining in the horse, because there's only one species from the precipice of extinction.
Understood. Now, you put a fascinating point about taming versus domestication. I'd like to quiz you a little bit more about that. Case in point being elephants. Elephants are also social, but given if we kept humans captured a rather low-key individual, not ranking too high in in the wild elephant social order. So free food, free reproduction, wouldn't this mean that the elephant allows itself to be domesticated? And if a corresponding partner was found, we could then have a domesticated sequence of elephants coming from that couple?
You have that in a way. I mean, elephants are a little bit of a blur between tame and domestication. They occupy a bit of a gray area because we do see in India and in places in Southeast Asia, we see elephants being used as beasts of labor. Obviously, tourist attractions, elephant rides. We see them used in warfare in India and in the Persian Empire. Alexander didn't use elephants. He thought they were not productive, and he's actually right. They're more of a hindrance, and the supply chain you need for elephants is ridiculous. So they actually are a drain on militaries. They're not a bonus whatsoever. And historically, if we look at the use of elephants in warfare, they're a disaster on multiple elements of the military kind of stratum. So Alexander was 100% right in not using elephants. He fought elephants. And did some experimentation with elephants and then was like, nah, forget this. And if we look at people who do use elephants, they're primarily on the losing side of the battle. So yes, elephants do occupy a kind of a gray area, but especially the Indian elephant or the Asian elephant, the African elephant is a completely different beast as well, which would not allow itself to be tamed. There's not a chance. So yes, but again, we've never fully domesticated any elephant species.
Understood. Now, my next question is going to be about honeybees. You mentioned that the PIE people brought honeybees with them into Europe and Asia.
So honeybees are specific to, again, when I use that reference in the horse book, it's trying to talk about languages being archaeological tools or words being archaeological finds. So when we look at languages, words that exist in a language are equally as important to words that don't exist. So, for example, and I use the example of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy of the indigenous peoples here in American Canada certainly didn't have a word in the language for smallpox or penguin before Europeans arrived. Or Europeans for that matter. So Europeans wouldn't have had a word for potato before, or corn before the Columbian Exchange. So we can put people, different groups of people all over the planet, we can put them on a map in both time and space because of the words they have and don't have in their languages. And I use honeybees as an example of where they exist in the Ural Mountains and then come into Europe, just like they're not here. And actually, in the Americas, when indigenous people saw honeybees, they knew that Europeans were close by. It was one of the markers they actually used to locate Europeans when they launched their intrusion on indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere. So um, that's the context I used honeybees in the book, was to locate specifically Indo-European peoples in a space and time on a map, which then correlates to the domestication of horses in one particular spot. It's a single site domestication on the Pontic-Caspian steppe roughly 5,500 years ago.
Understood. So this doesn't mean that honeybees didn't exist, wild honeybees didn't exist in that space. Rather, this is more of domesticated beekeeping practices or domesticated bees in that
No,
particular area.
both.
Oh,
Honeybees only exist that I think is west of the Ural Mountains. So when we see honeybees, they bring them. Yes, they bring them with them, but we know that they're being transported. That's not where they exist in a normal biological ecosystem. It's migration with humans.
wow. I'm sorry, I'm asking for one more question, but what were reasons that honeybees did not move west of the Ural Mountains?
That I don't know.
All
I'm
right,
not an
okay.
expert in bees. I'm not an ex. Mosquitoes, yes. I'm not an expert in bees or honeybees. I have no idea. My guess is the Eurasian steppe blocked them from coming across that cold swath of greater Eurasia to Europe. That would be my guess until they're introduced to Europe by humans. But again, that's just a hypothesis. I don't know the true answer. I guess that's like saying, why didn't elephants exist in Sweden? I mean, I'm guessing it's obviously climate is the reason why, or lack of specific trees or plants, because the steppe is pretty barren. So my guess is lack of habitat / cold temperatures.
Understood, understood. Now, following up on the PIE people, how did China hold out against these people when they were so successful elsewhere?
So Indo-European spread, I mean, all over Europe, the Indian subcontinent, and they make their way all the way across the steppe from the Yamnaya, from their homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, where they domesticate horses, and they're the only ones with horses. So, I mean, I have horses and no one else does. They're militaristic, they're patriarchal, and they're nomadic. So they spread their genetics and language and culture across Eurasia and the Indian subcontinent. I mean, I'm speaking Indo-European right now. 48% of the people on the planet speak Indo-European because the first domesticated horses, pardon another pun, had the ability to get the word out. And they're also I mean, this is not a benign process. So the Tocharian peoples or Tocharian speakers of the Indo-European peoples get all the way to Xinjiang province in western China with the Tarim Basin where the Uyghurs now are. And they introduced to China horses, chariots, bronze, certain agricultural practices. And then China takes a lot of this and blows it out of the water with their own sophisticated culture, which often gets overlooked in Eurocentric history. So eventually, China is being overrun by the Xiongnu from the north, which are Indo-European peoples. We know them as the Huns, the ancestors of Attila and his Huns, who then go head back west and sack Rome. So they are basically bribing the Chinese to give them slaves and silk and everything else because they have horses and the Chinese don't. And then Emperor Wu, beginning around 141 BCE, sends sends Zhang Qin and expeditions west to Central Asia to get horses in the Fergana Valley. And so it's actually quite remarkable. These expeditions are amazingly remarkable. So he goes out, he gets captured by the Xiongnu for 10 years. He escapes, he continues his expedition into Central Asia. So the countries of now Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and then travels the stands and gets back to Emperor Wu 14 years later and says, "Here I am." And I mean, remarkable stories and expeditions. Long story short, Emperor Wu needs horses to defend China from the Xiongnu or the Huns. So he sends his military, I believe, in the year 104 BCE to Central Asia, where he fights a bunch of battles after a series of failed expeditions. They keep pouring money into this, and they eventually conquer what is now Western China, which is Xinjiang province, and start bribing Indo-European peoples in the stands for horses. And they eventually get enough horses to defeat the Xiongnu in the Sino-Xiongnu Wars and solidify China as the nation state we now know. We continue the building of the Wall West towards the stands to protect what is now a unified nation state of China. And then because of that, the Xiongnu drift west and have a knock-on effect of all these Germanic tribes, which eventually brings down Rome. So the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, it's this domino effect from the Chinese beating the Xiongnu in what is Mongolian parts of Kazakhstan, pushing them west, which then they knock on Germanic tribes west, who then invade all of Europe, including bring down the Western Roman Empire. So there's a connection between the rise of China and the fall of Rome. And eventually it's the Xiongnu themselves, or a splinter group, which is Attila and his Huns, who bribe the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, amass a huge amount of wealth, and then head towards Rome. So all of this history is connected. It's a giant spider web, but at the end of the day, it has to come down to China's need of horses to safeguard newly confederated nation state of China.
Ancient
I know
history.
that was a very long answer, but it's hard to give that answer in a short answer. There's a lot going, moving pieces there.
Anyone who wants to know about it, I direct them directly to your book because the way that you put it is so fascinating. I ended up purchasing all those books on Assyria by Ephraim and as well as Scythia. Yes, I have a copy of
This
this.
is such, it was such a good book. Such a good book.
And I purchased Barry Cunliffe's book on the Scythians as well as Christopher Beckwith.
Yeah, all great books.
Just the way
Again,
that, sorry,
yeah,
continue.
I mean, I'm indebted in, obviously, I conduct years and years and years of research and read everybody else's works as well, and then connect some of my own dots that no one else has. And, but I mean, as Isaac Newton said, I may be a pygmy, but I'm a pygmy standing on the shoulder of giants and I can see further. So I'm indebted to all those authors and researchers who wrote, I mean, remarkable histories like the one I just pulled out here with from Syria. I mean, amazing.
That one particular paragraph, that passage was fantastic. I read it over and over and over again. It is wow. Why is it that this connection was not pulled up earlier?
Yeah, I don't know, and I think it is. It's just not made clear. I mean, you have historians making these connections, or I just taught the class I just finished. I told my class that we were actually just doing Sima Qian, the grand historian, and Emperor Wudi and or Emperor Wu, same guy, in class. And I said, no, the Chinese and Romans knew of each other. The Chinese have a name for the Roman Empire. They have a name for Marcus Aurelius. Like, there's Romans in China. They're like, what? They had no idea. I said, yeah, beginning about 200 BC, you have unfettered trade going from Rome to China in the east and back. And so we're finding all these I said the Colosseum was draped in silk curtains from China, and there's traders in China that are from Rome, and they were fascinated by this. I think people have made the connection. If they just didn't make it in a strong enough, or I guess lucid enough way to make it just simplify it and say, no, here it is, boom, 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 boom. The world is connected really around 200 BCE between East and West. It's not the Mongols. It's not Marco Polo. The steppe roads are vibrant and active facets of trade long before we ever thought. And so I think just the way I write it is maybe a little more narrative and a little probably more, I guess, accessible than some of the academic texts where it gets kind of lost in translation, because sometimes academic books are a slog.
I agree with that. Now, my next question is going to be about horses and their correlation with mining. Did horses help us strike the first gold?
No, I mean humans had been digging gold well before horses were domesticated. I mean, whether that's in Africa, Europe, well, Europe doesn't have a ton of gold, but or here in, excuse me, the Americas with the Inca and the Aztec, even before those two cultures, earlier indigenous civilizations here in certain Mesoamerica and in South America, not really in America and what is now Canada. But so no, but we use predominantly horses weren't, I mean, they were helped in mining, but miners preferred mules or donkeys to horses because they were smaller. So if you're thinking about a mine shaft, do you want a 17 and a half hand foot horse? No, you want small, compact animals who maybe they're not as, but you're not using them for their size, for their speed or stamina. You're using them specifically just for strength. And they're also cheaper than horses. So if we look at the US as a case study, when we look at Western mining in California, Colorado, Nevada, parts of Arizona, they're primarily using mules, and to a lesser extent donkeys, and to a lesser extent horses. There's certainly horses used in mining too, but that wasn't the primary pick. One, they're more expensive. Two, their legs are, there's a chance they get hurt more than a mule, and mules are have a more lower center of gravity, which you'd want in mine shafts. So, but a lot of there's no wild horses left on the planet. All the so-called wild horses are actually feral domesticates, and that includes the Przewalski's horses that are released in Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, China. There's about 2,000 of those. They're a subspecies of the Cavalline line because Przewalski's horses and the Cabalist horses can breed to produce fertile offspring. So Przewalski's horses, or the Tarpon, if you want, Mongolian wild horse, they're not a separate species. But the wild horses here in Colorado, where I now live, or wild horses in Nevada, they're not wild, they're feral, but a lot of them, they do DNA testing on these. Every horse that's pulled off the range, they DNA test them, and they can actually trace them back with some horses to the exact mine that they worked at, their ancestors, and were let go from. Because when the mines close, they just let these horses go, and then they become these part of these feral wild horse herds out here. So that's pretty cool, actually. But predominantly, they use mules.
Understood. Understood. Now, what came first, the horse or the wagon?
The wagon in a different with a wheel before the horse, but true wagons or chariots came after the domestication of horses. People were using wheels long before the domestication of horses, but it was for human or oxen power. So carts were pulled by humans or oxes, and we have artistic representations of this. We have carvings, we have paintings, the Standard of Ur, for example, which is some kind of probably an onager, not a horse pulling a battle cart. It's not really a chariot per se. It looks like a big, you can look at it, battle cart. But when we get horses, wheeled vehicles change dramatically with Indo-Europeans, whether that's the Yamnaya with the wagons and settling Eurasia, or this Sintashta culture, which then comes into the Indian subcontinent with spoked wheeled chariots, light chariots. So I guess the use or the evolution of wheeled vehicles takes a dramatic step in advancement once we domesticate horses.
Understood. Now, speaking again of evolution, now in warfare, did the composite crossbow come purely because we domesticated horses?
No, that's a separate invention. I can remember a lot off the top of my head, but the crossbow is not tied to horse domestication in any way. Um, it becomes an extremely valuable weapon, but it's a bit unwieldy actually to fire on horseback. So no, it's a separate invention, if you will, of weaponry. It's not tied to horse domestication. I mean, mounted archers certainly are, but not specifically the crossbow.
It seemed as if the composite crossbow was designed for horse-mounted warfare because lightweight, easy to flex, and it won't break.
Oh, you said horse warfare, yes, but not the domestication of horses. Sorry, I no, it's not tied to the domestication of horses per se when they are domesticated and the first, I guess, generations of domesticated horses.
Mhm.
Yes, certainly a handy weapon for mounted warfare, but that's not the original weapon of mounted warfare. It's a bow and arrow. Yes, sorry.
Okay. Now, speaking about the battle formations during his the Egyptian wars and wars around that time. So, how was cavalry deployed in those battle formations?
Well, the first true cavalry is the Assyrians. We have, I mean, obviously mounted warriors as soon as we start riding horses, which is either coincides with domestication or happens very shortly after where we're riding horses. Um, so we have individual warriors riding horses. We have raiding parties, if you want, riding horses. But the original people who domesticate horses are on the steppe, and their cultures are very, the way their societies work is it's very fluid, that lacks, I guess, administrative or bureaucratic structures. Kind of think of, it's difficult to explain, but so there's no really true cavalry in the way you think of it. That comes with the Assyrians in the 700s ish BCE. And if you know the Old Testament, I mean, it's the Assyrians who are just annihilating everybody in the Old Testament. Part of the reason is they have cavalry and no one else does, and they love war. And the other part is in order to appease their god, they can only appease their god Asher through conquest. So even by those standards of that time period, they are excessively violent and sadistic. The Assyrians are. They're also brilliant academics at the same time. So this weird dichotomy of sadistic conquerors who have mass deportations and are flaying people. And I mean, it is horrific stuff, even by that time standards. But at the same time, they're brilliant inventors, brilliant engineers, brilliant builders. They create the first modern library with the Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh. I mean, they're amazing academics. So they're a bit of a dichotomy, kind of like Alexander, although he's not sadistic. He's the greatest conqueror in world history. And then, I mean, I'll make an exception for Genghis Khan, but and then he's also a brilliant academic and loves academics. So the Assyrians are the ones who introduce true cavalry warfare and the fact of formations and discipline and training, which is an extension of the loose steppe mounted warfare. But it's also an extension of the Assyrian administrative bureaucratic system. They're really the first true empire that we have. I mean, perhaps the Akkadians with Sargon earlier, although it's very small compared to the Assyrians. We still in the modern world use the Assyrian bureaucratic, administrative, and military structures in modern society. So they're the precedent for that kind of centralized bureaucracy. So what that does is it feeds down into their military. So they have a very, very tight command and control structure compared to nomadic steppe warriors or anybody else for that matter, which is partly why they're so successful. But also they have the first true cavalry, which is their crux when they expand their empire to what is quite a wide swath of territory shortly before the rise of the Achaemenid, the Persian Empire, which the Medes are also become the Persians, help bring down the Assyrians as well. The large, pardon my language, but they piss so many people off with how sadistic they are and their slavery and their forced relocations and their starvation and their torture and all the stuff they do that they get hit from multiple fronts by numerous enemies at the same time, which leads to the destruction of Nineveh, which again is mentioned in the Bible amongst numerous other sources around the year 614 BCE, with Ashurbanipal being the last kind of great emperor of the Assyrian Empire.
Understood. Now, do we know why did Assyria choose to become so violent? Of course, violence was a way of life then, but as you mentioned, these guys were an exception.
They really are, even for the time period. They take it to a whole new level. I think, I mean, I can't get in their minds, but I think one is that's in order to conquer territory that are ethnically not Assyrians. That's one reason you do it. Two, they had just survived historically. If you look at the invasions of the Sea People, which were also horrifically violent, that had become a little more, that violence continued and became a little more prevalent in the ancient world, coming from the Sea People's invasions and really bringing down civilization across the Middle East and Egypt around the year 1150 BCE, which is also a great book. I think it's 1132, The Collapse of Civilization. I mean, a highly underrated book. I know it gets a lot of praise. It should get more. So coming on the heels of that, the Assyrian Empire, the first Assyrian Empire, shrinks back into itself, and then what we're talking about is the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the second go round, filling the power vacuum left by the invasions of the Sea People. And so I think it set the precedent. The Sea People set this kind of precedent for violence, but also at the same time the Assyrians rule through violence, and that's just part of the culture. And some of that goes back to their spirituality, of that is how they are supposed to appease their own god. So I think it's cultural, it's spiritual, and it's kind of the perfect storm of violence conquering sadism in a way. I mean, it is there. They are brutal.
There should be a book ideally on psychoanalyzing violence and how see people then cascaded a series of violence, which then became normalized with the new Assyrians and then others who followed.
Well, and interestingly, with the Assyrians, the next big empire obviously is the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire, and they are not big on violence. I mean, Cyrus conquers most of this empire through diplomacy and human rights. Hey, those people are attacking you. I will protect you. You can keep your faith, keep your religion, keep everything you have. You'll still be in charge. Give me some taxes and some soldiers, and I'll protect you. They're like, sweet. Then he goes to the next village and does the same thing. Realistically, when he starts to expand his empire, it's done largely through peace. Mind you, he always has, plan B to say, oh, really? Well, see that behind me? This is mighty. And so he does have that kind of backing him, but most cultures willingly join the Persians until he gets to what become the fringes of the Persian Empire, when we're getting into Egypt and we're getting up into parts of southern Central Asia and the Caucasus, where these are Scythian peoples, these are Indo-European peoples, and they're like, no way. For example, the Massagetae, which are the Amazons of Greek lore, this is where he meets his demise in battle. So, but the original expansion is relatively peaceful, and the same can be said for a lot of Alexander's empire. I mean, he did do fighting for sure, but he's greeted as a liberator in Egypt from Persian rule and anointed a god. I mean, again, Alexander, if he has to fight, fine, but a lot of it is people just bowing to his will. Again, at the same time, he sets examples of people by the city of Tyre and, selling them all into slavery, and he has good propagandists, and he's not afraid to fight. And obviously his reputation literally precedes him, because he sends propagandists forward and say Alexander's coming. But whether it's untying the Gordian knot, he didn't have to fight there. So I think what we see actually with certainly the Persian Empire with Cyrus and Darius, maybe not so much Xerxes, is that they actually kind of go the other way. And they do a lot of it through diplomacy and kind of bargaining instead of actually violence. As we know with Persian records, Egyptian records, and a ton of other, the book of Ezra, for example, with freeing the Judeans from Babylonian captivity and giving them back their homeland and building temples, and the Cyrus cylinder. So I think there's I mean, unfortunately, violence, at least since the dawn of the agricultural revolution, is part of human nature because it's about greed. It comes down to that. When we're hunter gatherers, there's really not that much violence. There's really no warfare in the way we know it today. It's the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago really creates all the ills of the modern world. And while I disagree with Jared Diamond on some of his interpretation of history, I will give him full props and agree with him 100% that agriculture was the worst mistake in human history, bar none. So every people like to, I blame Trump, I blame Obama, I blame Biden, everybody blaming everybody, right? I blame the first farmers for everything. I wake up every morning and go, oh, curse the first farmers because they screwed us over. But they didn't have a choice. Climate change forced them to start farming. So I really, it was a matter of survival. But
Right. My next question is going to be about bureaucracy and how did this help the new Assyrian Empire, the Persians, and the others who had a solid bureaucratic division? Was this bureaucracy shaped in part or in entirety by horses?
um, in a way, yes, because when the Assyrians used their horses, we think of the royal road when we look at specifically Darius or Darius with the Persian Empire, not so much Cyrus, but um, the next in line, which is Darius or Darius, is actually Darius, but the royal road, the Persian mail system, like neither rain nor sleet nor darkness of night. That's the Persian model that the U.S. plagiarizes and steals. That precedent for that communication network that the Persians do, then the Chinese do, and then obviously the Americans do with the Pony, short-lived Pony Express. That's actually an Assyrian invention. They're the ones who have the first royal road across their empire. They're the ones who have these communication outposts that contain essentially a post office and a military garrison. They're the ones who are exchanging horses. The Persians actually just copy this, and a lot of people think this starts with Darius's royal road and the Persian infrastructure. It's actually the Assyrians. So the ability to have in order to have a centralized bureaucracy or a centralized command and control structure, you have to have the ability to communicate quickly and effectively. And because of the Assyrian infrastructure, which includes this message delivery system, that gives them the ability to communicate quickly and to give orders and disseminate orders across the empire in a very timely fashion. So yes, their use of horses in part is certainly a huge piece of a very effective centralized bureaucracy.
Understood. Now, speaking about Nineveh's demise at the hands of the Cimmerians and Scythians, how is it that these people managed to bring down this war machine with an efficient bureaucracy that too?
Some of it has to do with environmental factors. Again, there's some famine. The Assyrians, they are lacking timber. There's certain elements of their agricultural practices that actually uh, begin kind of these series of Malthusian checks, if you will, with famine and drought. So that's part of it. The other problem is they've just pissed too many people off in their conquest. So you have the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Cimmerians, like Crimea. They're another group of Indo-Europeans, but they're west of what is Assyria, the Scythians. So they have numerous internal problems, environmental problems. There's some palace intrigue and some infighting amongst some of the Assyrian elites. And then they get kind of start in a way rotting from the inside, and then they're hit from the outside. And if we look at all great empires across history, it's usually how it starts. They start to rot internally, and then when they start to weaken, then they're hit from the outside by I guess external armies or external invaders. So it's really a combination of things that lead to the Assyrian demise. They also overextend themselves and make too many enemies at the same time. So it's a series of, or kind of a coalescence of numerous factors, and it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it takes, it's like anything else. Most things don't happen overnight. It's a process, if you will. And there is Assyrian so-called Assyrian emperors after Ashurbanipal, but really he's the last great Assyrian ruler.
Understood. Now, did the Scythians derive inspiration for their kingdoms from the Greeks, or did the Greeks derive inspiration from Scythians?
So Herodotus writes about the Scythians, and he talks. So does Aristophanes, Lysistrata, and so they're mentioned in a lot of. But keep in mind, this is important that anybody who was not Greek was a barbarian. Flat, just that's it. Point end. Anyone who is not Greek, the Greeks viewed as a barbarian. So Scythians actually were in Athens. They used them. They had mercenaries in to complement Greek cavalry and Greek military, primarily cavalry, because the Scythians are mounted warriors for the most part. And then when the Scythians retired from these augmented auxiliary cavalry units, they became police, and actually they were the security for Athenian democracy, and they would force people to go vote and almost intimidate people to go vote, if you will, their democratic duty in early Athens. And so they were used as police forces, but they were also mocked in Greek culture. If you read Lysistrata, the Scythians are the comic relief. They're the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or the comic relief in Aristophanes' play, which is really an anti-war play from the Peloponnesian Wars, and also a pro-women play in a way too. It's genius. But so they were known firsthand or first person to Greeks. People had met Scythians, and my guess is Aristophanes had met Scythians, Herodotus had met Scythians in Greece itself. So that's kind of the connection between them. And Herodotus writes about their culture and their scalping and carving people's skulls off, and their marijuana practices. I mean, he talks about how they hotbox their tents and they smoke weed, and which is all actually true. We can't trust Herodotus completely, but you can corroborate a lot of his stories, and that is true. So, no, I wouldn't say the because again, the Scythian warfare is very, very different than we see with Greek warfare, which relies on heavy hoplite infantry, not so much cavalry. It's really King Philip, who's Alexander's dad, and Alexander who kind of reinvent cavalry to what we think of modern cavalry, and that's the crux of Alexander's military, or his genius is the way he really uses cavalry, which he inherits a lot of this from King Philip, like Alexander's dad Philip. And it's another one of those things. And I mean, Alexander's my hero. After my parents and Yoda, he's next. So but again, we underestimate the importance of Philip and his military reforms on the Macedonian military, which Alexander inherited. King Philip, I mean, the transformations he made in the military before he was assassinated were unbelievable, revolutionary, and Alexander certainly was a part of this, fighting alongside his dad, and then took these kind of revolutionary transformations and kept going with them. So it's really, we see Philip and Alexander being revolutionizing cavalry, I guess, after the Assyrian true cavalry, but they're not doing what Alexander and Philip were doing.
All right. Now, I'm not sure if this is a part of your research, but the Pazaric horseman and his feathered helmet, cape, and trousers. This then becomes standard Greek uniform, or at least how Hollywood represents it. So, did the Greeks actually adopt this style from the Scythians?
Oh, from the caped horsemen, like the on the carpet.
Yes.
Oh, I have no idea. I don't know where that well, also the Scythians don't really dress like that, to be honest. Remember, they're steppe people, so they're migrating across. They're nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, which is, it's really not suitable clothing for -40 Celsius in barren, windy landscapes. I think I don't know what that particular person who's on that carpet, and I don't know why people are dressing like Superman in the ancient world with their tights and their capes, but I don't know if it has to do with the Scythians per se. And keep in mind, the Scythians again is a general term representing a lot of different peoples. Um, the different groups of Scythians, because of their environment, are very, very, very different. So, um, again, the Scythians that King Philip runs into or Alexander runs into are very different from the Scythians that Cyrus the Great runs into, or certainly the Scythians who are further into what is now Iran. So I don't know where the cape comes from, or that particular that picture of the horseman wearing his pants and his cape. Pants, I can say, come from riding horses. That is a fashion that was invented 100% when we start riding horses, is the invention of pants. Because before that, people are wearing kilts and togas and sarongs and wraps with no undergarments. And you get on the back of a horse, male or female, and you're going to realize pretty quickly that we need a garment that is suitable for riding horses. So pants 100% are invented for horseback riding. The cape, I don't know about the cape.
Understood. Understood. Now, about PI influenced or PI dissonant cultures, Scythians fielded women as warriors, and we'd seen with the early Proto-Indo-Europeans that patriarchy was quite strong. So, is this an aberration? Is just a one-off, or is this part of a greater norm?
Well, again, the original Indo-Europeans were talking, give or take, 3,500 BCE, and then they spread all over Eurasia and groups of Indo-Europe. That's why we have so many Indo-European languages now, as they get isolated in various geographical pockets, and their languages evolve to be Pashto, Greek, English, German, Welsh, whatever. So, like anything else, cultures evolve that are independent of what was your ancestor. I mean, yeah, Canadian culture. I'm Canadian. Our culture is based on England and France and Indigenous peoples, but Canadian culture is uniquely Canadian. It's certainly not American. It's not British. It's not French. It's Canadian. So I think what you see is, again, the term Indo-European represents more of a linguistic group than it does a cultural group by that time. So when we're talking 500 BCE, with Cyrus being chopped his head off by the Massagatai, a group of Scythians, or what the Greeks call Amazons, which means without breast, they are women warriors. They are led by women, Queen Tomyris. But again, you have 3,000 years between the original Indo-Europeans who spread across Eurasia within 1,000 years to the Massagatai, which are a group of Scythians who are women, who are matriarchal and have female warriors. The other thing is, a lot of these populations are so small that women also learned how to hunt, so they could shoot a bow and arrow. So in times of self-defense, it doesn't matter if you're male or female. Everybody can pick up a bow and shoot to defend themselves. We especially see this with nomadic horse-based cultures. Whether we see it in the Cheyenne in the United States. We see it with the Lakota, that they had women warriors. So we see it in nomadic horse-based cultures where everybody learns how to ride and shoot from a very young age. So in warfare, your essentially warrior class is it's a weird word. When we look at the European, it's males, only males, ages 18. I'm making this up, 18 to 40, but that's not the case in smaller nomadic cultures where everybody can defend themselves if necessary. So were there women warriors? Certainly, yes. But again, the original Indo-Europeans are highly patriarchal and militaristic. But you have so much evolution and isolation between Indo-European groups happening over 3,000 years that they develop very different cultures and languages. I mean, Spanish is Indo-European, but so is Polish, and those cultures are completely different. Or the Indian subcontinent cultures compared to the United Kingdom, both Indo-European languages and cultures, but not really. So I think when we have to be careful with kind of these monolithic, I guess, views of what Indo-Europeans are or Scythians are, it's very, very different.
Each of them evolving according to their circumstances and conditions.
for sure, based on, I mean, environmental pressures,
Right,
um,
right,
and social pressures. So yeah, that by the time Cyrus is killed by a group of Scythians who are women warriors, I mean, you've had 3,000 years of sociocultural evolution. So
right. Understood. Now, returning to your hero, or more specifically, your hero's father, King Philip, what inspired him to incorporate horses into his army and field a cavalry division?
I mean, the Greeks had been using horses, but Greek cavalry was more of a plaything for the nobility in Greece than it was really a suitable combat arm, if you will, or a bludgeon combat arm. It was more Greek noblemen would stand on the side riding their horses of the battle and prance around and play out war. Then they used cavalry, but so there's some precedent for that within Greek culture, but I think Macedonia was just isolated unto itself. There is some Persian influence, certainly, because Macedonia was a satrapy or uh, some. They weren't part of the Persian Empire, but they were. What's the word I'm looking for? Um, Not allied, even, but kind of sub. Not even, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but it can't come to my mind. But so there's certainly some Persian influence because the Persians did have quite sophisticated cavalry in the years leading up to Alexander's reign, if you will, and he was a huge fan of the Persian kings, right? Alexander's one of his heroes, if not his biggest hero, was Cyrus. So he's reading everything he can get his hands on Persian military tactics, Persian history, Cyrus conquering the Achaemenid Empire, the Persian Empire. He's a huge fan of Persia. So Aristotle's Alexander's private tutor, the reading list that he's given incorporates so many different cultures. So Alexander's just reading all this on top of the fact that what Philip does is the court at Pella, which is the capital of Macedonia, really becomes a military think tank. Philip has people from all over the known world coming to Pella, and he's picking their brains and they're talking, and he's, again, books and reading strategy. And so I think it's a combination of these things. And Alexander grows up in this world of this military think tank in different cultures, and also being open-minded enough to understand that other cultures have something to offer him, and specifically the Persian culture, because he's a huge fan of Persia. So I think that kind of coalesces in this military genius of what becomes Alexander. And also he's a narcissist. I mean, you combine this military genius with this clinical narcissism to take over the ends of the earth. It's a deadly combination when he sets out east to conquer the Persian Empire and then some.
Understood. How is it that Alexander managed to defeat the Persians despite the Persians having fantastic cavalry?
Well, the Persian, by this time, the Persian cavalry is a little bit, it's watered. It's not quite the same cavalry that originally Cyrus would have had, but it's how Alexander, he's outnumbered 2-1, 3-1 in every battle. He is really, it's again back to Philip. The Macedonian army is really only about 40,000 people when Alexander crosses the Hellespont and marches against Darius III. But it's the way he uses cavalry. He has heavy cavalry, he has light cavalry, he has skirmish, and then the infantry, he has skirmishers, he has light infantry, heavy infantry. But Alexander's genius, and he always commands his companion cavalry, which is the elite cavalry on the right flank, and the Scythians are on the left flank, who are also horse experts. They're the cavalry on the other flank. But Alexander's genius is know when to strike at the precise spot, at the precise moment, to break those enemy lines. And that's his genius, is how he reads a battlefield. However, I often say to my students, is it because Alexander was that good, or every other commander in ancient history was just that bad. And so that's a question I always ask in military history, whether it's the triumphs of Alexander, whether it's the triumphs of Julius Caesar, is it that they're that good, or the enemies they're facing, specifically the commanders they're facing, are actually just that incompetent? And it makes Alexander look better than he actually is. It makes Caesar look better than he actually is. It makes William the Conqueror look better than he actually is. And I think it's a combination of both. I think when you look at military strategy, a lot of these, excluding Hannibal, Alexander, and Julius Caesar, I think a lot of these commanders have no clue what they're doing. And they're playing at war, but they're not really military like tacticians or military strategists. They're a ruler who rules because he's the next son in line. Well, that doesn't make you a great military genius. So I think we have these exceptions in history with Alexander, Hannibal, Cyrus, and Julius Caesar in ancient history. And really, my list doesn't go much past those really three until we get to Genghis Khan and then Napoleon. So I think it's probably a bit of both. But I think some of them were just that bad.
I like the way you put it, that you give it a much more humane and plausible explanation that the battles were also on account of incompetence as much as they were about competence. It's not that Alexander or Napoleon were extraordinarily intelligent. Of course, they were intelligent and they knew how to make those tactical calls at the right time, but it's also in part because of their enemy's incompetence.
Oh, I mean, for sure. When you look at Hannibal and you look at his string of victories until Scipio takes over the Roman army, he's another one you could probably put in that list of who actually knows what he's doing in ancient warfare. Scipio certainly has a very sound strategic and tactical mind. But when you look at the Battle of Cannae, for example, I mean, he just lures the Romans in time and time again into these kill zones, and then does his double pincer movement. Like at some point, aren't you learning? No, don't break formation and charge headlong into a kill formation that was specifically designed for you to chase. And they keep making the same mistakes until Scipio really takes over. And so, yes, I think if you really get into the weeds of the tactics of some of these ancient battles, it's sheer incompetence on behalf of the loser and part brilliance on behalf of the winner, as you just said. So it's not to take away from Hannibal's tactical genius either, but the incompetence of the Romans is on full display time and time and time again.
Understood. Now, why is it that Alexander's battle tactics did not get absorbed into the local satraps or splinter kingdoms that formed after his demise?
Well, I think it depends on where you're looking. Is you have to have a horse culture to begin with. So if we look at the Egyptians, didn't really have a huge horse culture. Certainly, the Scythians are not going to absorb tactical formations the way Alexander uses because there are no nomadic people and their military. Again, as I said earlier, it's very fluid. It's very individualistic. It's not. It's more, I guess, free flowing, if you will, kind of like a more marauding based military kind of culture. So that's part of the reason. It is shocking that the Romans really don't adopt a cavalry tradition. Roman cavalry is terrible, with the exception of Julius Caesar. He's one of the few Roman commanders who actually knew how to use cavalry. If you look at Crassus, if you look at some of these other Roman commanders, they have no idea. So there actually wasn't. We kind of think of the Romans that should, of their military prowess, that they'd have a competent horse tradition or cavalry tradition, and they really don't, which is quite shocking because they inherit everything else from the Greeks, from academia to mythology to some legal systems, but not that. We do see it actually in India coming out of Alexander. We see, I mean, obviously war was a very serious proposition in India long before Alexander gets there, but we do see parts of India adopt a lot of Greek cavalry training practices and cavalry tactics, on top of some of their own cavalry tactics that they had developed pre-Alexander. So actually what we see in India is a blend of some of their own cavalry traditions and then overlaid with what they learned from the Macedonians. So it's a bit of both when we look at the legacy, I suppose, of Alexander and his satrapies and his successors, if you successor states or successors in that part of the world. Um, it's a bit of combination of both. Certainly, there was an Indian cavalry tradition before that, and actually some very unique tactical developments in India prior to Alexander, and then they incorporate a lot of the Macedonian cavalry training um, into there are pre-existing cavalry traditions. So it's kind of a blend, and there's a lot of that can be said with the Greek influence on Indian culture, specifically in that area of India, like the northern part. Um, and again, it doesn't take away from pre-existing Indian accomplishments. It's actually makes sense if there's something that's good, well, why not adopt it? And that is the genius of Alexander. That's the genius of Cyrus. That's actually the genius of the Mongols too. The Mongols had a navy. The Mongols learned how to do siege warfare. The Mongols learned how to build bridges. I mean, that's the genius, is not to be so xenophobic or accept the exceptionalism idea that everything we do is the best and everything else isn't up to speed. So we see this blending of Greek and Indian culture in that part of the world, which is actually kind of cool, and is something that I'd actually like. I mean, I know enough about it in the Alexander context, but would like to know actually more about just outside of horses and cavalry, which is pretty neat.
Understood. Now, after the fall of Rome, Western Rome especially, what happened with respect to horses? How long before horses came back into Europe?
Well, there's always horses in Europe, but what happens really with the modern horses is it's the expansion of Islam in the. I mean, Christianity has a slow and tortured spread over its original, really first 500 years. I mean, the Council of Nicaea in 325 gives it kind of a kickstart, and then, but really the first 400 years of Christianity is a slow, very slow, pocketed spread, where in the century following Muhammad, Islam spreads like wildfire across the world. And so what we see is when the Moors and the Berbers invade Spain and start Al Andalus, we have to remember that Muslims ruled Spain for 800 years. And we often forget 800 years, Spain and Portugal were Al Andalus, a very sophisticated, artistic, academic part of the Islamic Caliphate. And so when they do that in the 700s, when they invade the Iberian Peninsula and set up Al Andalus, they bring with them Arabian horses. And once the Arabian horse is introduced into Europe and the rest of the world, the game's over, because it is the premier horse, really. The Turkoman and the Arabian horse is the premier horse for, I mean, speed, really. And obviously all thoroughbred horses are a descendant of three Arabian horses that were in England in the late 1600s and early 1700s to this day, which is crazy. That's a lot of inbreeding. But so, yes, the Arabian horse kind of changes the game coming out of the Islamic conquest, not just of Spain and Portugal, but also, I mean, North Africa, Central Asia, obviously the Middle East, and then even into parts of Eastern Europe and what becomes the Ottoman Empire. So,
Right. I interviewed Richard Stasevich on his book, The Decline and Rise of Democracy, in which he outlines that Islam, in part, was propelled because of the Persian Empire, whom the first Muslims had captured, and their fantastic hold on bureaucracy helped them spread really quickly.
I mean, there's so many reasons for the spread of Islam or the Islamic two early Islamic empires that are, I believe, in the top five largest empires in the history of the world, and they're successive Islamic empires. Um, so there's a lot of reasons for it. There's a lot of reasons that are linked to Islamic spiritual traditions and spiritual teachings, a lot linked to Islamic social practices. There's a lot of reasons why it spread so quickly. Some of it has to do with socialism within Islam and a redistribution of wealth. It has to do with education with Islam, because Islam places a high priority not just on spiritual education, but also academic education as well. And part of the, the the windfall or the flowering of Islam leads to the Islamic Renaissance. And what we see coming out of the Islamic world in terms of engineering and mathematics and medicine is unbelievable. And again, because of our Eurocentric worldview, at least in the Western world, or Islamophobia now, obviously with what's going on in the world, we overlook, or we just don't give enough credit to the Islamic Renaissance and the amount of science and technology that comes out of the Islamic Renaissance, really from the years kind of 800 to 1100 ish, is unbelievable. And it's due in part to Alexander and his depositing of all the Greek academia across his empire. And then Islamic scholars save it and they translate it, and then they actually gift it back to Europe during the Dark Ages, which helps Europe, affords Europe a ladder to climb out of. They weren't quite as dark as people make them be, I get that, but it's part of the reason for the European Renaissance, on this piggybacking on the coattails of the Islamic Renaissance. And I mean, I'll give it just an example so people believe what I'm saying. Is Copernicus thanks Islamic scholars in his acknowledgments for his revolutionary solar system. And he's like, well, actually, I just kind of took what they wrote and tweaked it a little bit, but this has already been. So again, right there, astronomy, astrology, it is what they do has been drastically overlooked in modern times because of the dominance, what seemingly the dominance of Western world in pop culture and in academia, and then xenophobia and, I suppose, exceptionalism, if you will. And I outline this very clearly in my horse book when I talk about the Islamic Renaissance, and I do it in my classes when I teach my students how much we owe to Islamic scholars, which gets shamefully overlooked.
Understood. Now, returning to the Battle of Tours, how did Charles Mantel help turn the tide? How did he get horses in the first place?
Well, it's not so much horses; it's the use of the stirrup. He gets a horse. I mean, again, Europeans have horses. He. So this is year 732. He has horses. How he raises his army is he essentially bribes the church to give him lands and give him wealth so he can train an army, which the church isn't happy to do. But then at the same time, what we get is Charles Martel, and obviously then his grandson Charlemagne, which is, Charles the Great. He's named after his grandfather, which is Charles Martel. We get the Franks, the Mergovian kind of dynasty turning into the Franks. Is that we get this is when we start to combine in a way some of the church and state, and how they're combined is because of this. So that's how he raises the money. His cavalry is a Frankish tradition. The Franks are Germanic people who are part of this knock-on effect coming from the Xiongnu being defeated by the Chinese, is all part and parcel of the same thing. So they settle in France. So they have a very horse tradition, an equine-based culture. They have cavalry. They have heavy cavalry, because this is the origins of feudalism, actually, is with Charles Martel, and the origins of heavy cavalry. they have stirrups. Stirrups are a Chinese invention that make their way across the steppe, and the Franks adopt stirrups. The Islamic army doesn't. What stirrups allow you to do is you become one. It's more of a you become more of a centaur. You become more stable on your fighting platform, which is the horse. It allows you to have heavier armor, allows you to have heavier weaponry, it allows you to armor your horse, and it also allows you to be able to both give and take punishment better because you're locked in with your stirrups. So he has heavy cavalry. The Moors, led by Abdul Rahman Al Ghafiqi, who's a very good commander, and they have very good cavalry as well. The problem is again, the Franks take the high ground. Charles Martel hides his cavalry, and they play a game of chicken. And he basically says, I'm in the defensive position. In warfare, the defender always has the advantage. For every I was in the Canadian Army for 9 years. What they tell you is that for every defender, you need 3 attackers. That's the ratio, 3-to-1. So the armies are roughly equal, but the problem is Charles outweights Al Ghafiqi, and he eventually attacks. And that is not how actually the Moors fight. So he breaks with his own kind of tradition and his own tactics because he's getting impatient. And when he attacks, he gets lured in, and there's a flank with heavy cavalry. It's not to say that Charles's infantry doesn't perform well. They do. And according to all the sources, they stand like a wall in repeated attacks by the Muslim army. But then it's the flanking cavalry attack that kind of seals to the rear lines, that seals Charles's victory. So it's not just but it is his cavalry. But if his infantry didn't hold, which they do against repeated frontal attacks, he doesn't have a chance to do his flanking movement with the cavalry. I mean, again, it's classic Alexander tactics, but so that's why. And what happens then is heavy cavalry gives rise to feudalism and what we think of medieval knights who weren't chivalrous at all. They were a bunch of thugs to keep serfs and peasants in line for the lord of the manor. That's what that knights originally were for. And they were very expensive to outfit a knight. It was the equivalent of 48 cows. So one knight, to outfit them with their gear and their equipment and their horse, was the equivalent of 48 cows. So they could only be, I guess, raised by wealthy people who then use them to subjugate their peasantry in this loosely defined feudal system. So that is, I guess, a negative of heavy cavalry. They're really just kind of doing the bidding of their lords. They're just thugs. They're certainly not chivalrous in any which way.
You should have a chat with Thomas Piketty on inequality and its origins. This is itself a meta thread for it. How heavy cavalry helped develop feudalism or cement it.
Yes, cemented. There was, again, there's no concrete definition of feudalism amongst historians or political scientists. There's no, this is what it's a loose definition, and feudalism was very different in the seigneurial system and the manorial system. And France isn't the same as England, and Germany certainly not the same as England. So again, these monolithic terms are very kind of dangerous, but in the loose base, simplest form of feudalism, it was all based on service aligned to raising military forces when need be, based in exchange for the crown giving these lords land. And so in order to keep the peasants in line and working your land as a lord, you had knights who brutalized them. I mean, it was just straight up brutality. And then when the king needed a military, he called the lords and the knights to serve in his military. So that's a lot. It was, money really wasn't exchanged in the feudal system. It's not an idea of cash-based kind of market economics. It's more of service in the form of farming with the peasants and military service with the lords and the knights. And it's loose based, but again, there's no concrete definition of feudalism. But certainly the stirrup, which leads to heavy cavalry or knights, is certainly a huge piece of why we see the development or evolution of feudalism in Europe. There's no question about that.
Yes, sticking to its strictest and basest definition, yes, exactly. Because, of course, expressions of feudalism would have varied across different parts of the world, depending, as our conversation says, context and circumstances, local circumstances.
Yeah,
It would have evolved separately. But sticking to its basest definition, yes.
yeah, yeah, and you're right. And as I mentioned, again, these monolithic to feudalism or Indo-Europeans,
Monoliths
it's
are
like,
dangerous. I agree.
yeah, or all indigenous peoples in North America, Canada, the U.S. They're all the same. They're just, no, not even all Europeans are the same. All Indians are the same. It's dangerous, but unfortunately, for purposes of explanation, it's hard not to generalize or create these monolithic identities as much as we don't want to or shouldn't as historians or academics, but it's difficult not to. But yes, feudalism is varied across Europe, across the world, just like when we talked about slavery in that it's not this, we just think African chattel slavery, which is not really the definition of, certainly not before that. And various indigenous cultures and different peoples all over the world have various forms, if you will, of labor dynamics, but that doesn't necessarily mean people are mistreated either in the chattel slavery way. So again, we have to be careful with these kind of broad stroke definitions.
Absolutely agreed. Now, moving forward in time and space, the horses entering Native American culture and language. Did any of these tribes deify horses?
Oh, for sure. There's what the again, I don't like the term, but horse cults. So and there's horse effigies, and we have all sorts of yes, for sure. So horses became, I mean, like Indo-Europeans when they first domesticated them. If you realize that it wouldn't take very long to realize the utilitarian, monumental impact that these animals could have on your socioeconomic, cultural attributes. I mean, they are the Swiss Army knife of animals. They do everything for us, whether it's farming, warfare, trade, migration, travel, food in the form of milk and meat. I mean, they're it. They're a machine. They are like the greatest human invention machine ever. And so it they very quickly steal horses, adopt, again, not all, very few indigenous people actually. We're talking about specifically plains nations, and then even more specifically, we're talking about the Comanche in the southern plains and the Lakota or Sioux in the northern plains. Yes, the Crow, the Nez Perce, there's other groups too who adopt, but it's the plains people primarily, so they can take advantage and utilize the plains. They can turn grass into usable energy to harvest bison, and then it leads to horse wars and it actually is a terrible thing and undermines their traditions, their mores. It undermines gender roles. It leads to class and hierarchy within what were egalitarian societies, and ultimately leads to their subjugation. So these horse nations last no more than 200 years across the plains. But yes, they very quickly adopt a horse culture. And again, when we think, when there's numerous nations that do this, but the two big ones who kind of come to dominate and create empires, if you will, in the southern plains, it's the Comanche, which are a splinter group of Shoshone, and then the Lakota in the northern plains, who migrate from Minnesota over the Mississippi and Missouri rivers into the northern plains in the 16 and 1700s.
Understood. Now, did horses change some of these tribes' ways? For example, if assuming some of these tribes were matrilineal, did they change to patriarchal because of the introduction of horses and firearms?
No, if we look at matriarchal systems, when we think matriarchy, it's like flag here is this is the Mohawk flag, but the Iroquois Confederacy or the Haudenosaunee, they are truly matriarchal. The Sioux or Lakota or Comanche are not matriarchal. what the horse does is it undermines egalitarian um, principles, and it undermines gender roles. It undermines female gender roles. It's not that they're matriarchal; it's that it takes away power of women. Women have a very specific powers and roles within these indigenous societies. So, long story short, is prior to the introduction of the horse, indigenous peoples hunted bison, but they only hunted as much as they needed because there's no surplus and there's no capitalist economy in North America at this time. So you're not, and they're not farmers, so you're not hunting for more than you need because there's no, you don't, you're not hunting for a capitalist surplus economy. So you either, plus they're on foot, so it's dangerous chasing a bison herd on foot. So they basically take a few, or they herd them off cliffs like head smash and buffalo jump in Alberta, Canada, or they corral them in kill zones in box canyons and take what they need for then and for the winter. What horses do is twofold. It allows them to slaughter bison at an industrial level for the capitalist American and Canadian fur trades. So the Comanche alone, by the end of the 1700s, are killing 550,000 bison a year. 550,000 for the fur trade. What this does, it creates hierarchy of powers based on wealth. The more horses you have, the more bison you can kill, the more wealthy you can get. So it's a cyclical pattern. And the more horses you get, the more brides you can get through bride wealth by trading horses for women. So what happens is, if you are one of these men who own tons of horses, you can harvest more bison, but you don't need more women to process the bison hides. So you have 20 wives, 50 wives. Your first three are your real wives, who essentially are treated with the cultural norms of that society, but the rest are dressed differently, can't own possessions, and are really used as slave labor to process bison hides. The other problem is, because of the horse wars, a lot of these indigenous nations are upwards of 65-75% women. So fathers are all too happy to unload their daughters as bride wealth in exchange for horses. So it undermines gender roles in that way with the female components of these nations, but then it creates a hierarchy of power and wealth within the male side. So if you don't have horses, you're considered lesser than. So the Canadian and American governments use this kind of animosity and this hierarchy of power to do divide and conquer within these indigenous nations and eventually subjugate them. So the horse is just as bad as, I say, guns, germs, steel, and horses. It's not a trifecta, it's four. Is that horses undermine indigenous peoples horribly and lead to their subjugation. It is not the sole beneficial element of the Columbian Exchange, as people often think. Quite the opposite. So ultimately, the horse helps in the demise and subjugation of these cultures on the plains, which is opposite of what people think from the movies.
Understood. This is why your book should be more publicized and deserves its space alongside Jared Diamond. And which is why we're having this conversation at length, that you outlined this beautifully, and here we are.
Well,
It's
thank you. I
this
appreciate it.
rich, this it's a rich treasure trove of insights. I mean, I'm getting wowed question after questions. The amount of insights is just tremendous.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Now, my next question is going to be about horses in the post-industrial era. Horses had to be unfortunately abandoned, or we had to move on with motor vehicles because of excrement. But assuming we found some means for disposing excrement sustainably, might horses have continued on and we would have performed better without motor cars?
It wasn't necessarily the horse excrement that's swallowing cities, literally swallowing cities. That was the shift to the automobile. The automobile just displaced the horse. It really, because there's a by the great horse manure crisis of the 1800s. There's actually meetings to decide what can we do about this, and the solution, it lasts 2 days and the solution is nothing. So I'd like to think that our own climate change crisis with greenhouse gases will last longer than 2 days, but you know, it's interesting right now. I'll leave it at that. Because climate change is real. But anyway, science is an amazing thing. So it's really the internal combustion engine just outruns the horse and makes it, you know, insufficient for modern society when we get the rise of the machine. So it's not so much the manure pollution, which they just don't have an answer for, but you can't get rid of horses because they do everything. It would be like getting rid of all planes, trains, and automobiles and saying we're not having any of it. Well, society can't function. The same would be if you removed horses from London or the world in 1885 or 1895. It's not possible. The economy couldn't function, the society couldn't function without them, which is, again, back to my original point at the beginning of the conversation is you can't say that about very many things, that if you removed them, it would change the world to an extent that the world or modern world would be unrecognizable. You can say that about the horse. This is why they didn't get rid of them. So the internal combustion engine fairly quickly, actually, really between 1900 and 1920, unseats the horse in, at least in the Americas. In Europe, it's really not till after the Second World War. But in the United States, during the interwar years, I mean, America's fully motorized. And it's the first. Canada and Britain are the next. And then after the Second World War, it's the whole world. But when you think about the time span of history, the primary mode of transportation, which had lasted 5,500 years, is usurped within really 50 years.
Right.
In exchange for cars. And then the horse really becomes a non-issue, and we use it for recreation and for very specific functions, but it loses its preeminent place as our sidekick in making history, but also as the preeminent machine that's driving human society.
Understood. Now, instead of reducing the horse today to a recreational animal or treated as a component in pet food, what might be a fitting tribute toward horses? How can we give back to horses given how much they help transform our society?
Well, I think we have in a way, because other than very select military use, other than very select uses in police forces, um, they're pets and they're used for recreation for the most part. So yes, we still use them for police. Yes, we still use them in certain military functions. The American Army, the Chinese Army, we still have true cavalry units to patrol inaccessible frontiers. But realistically, we've given the horse back, I suppose, everything we could, because they're no longer a beast of burden, and they're, generally speaking, cared for as pets. And that's not true in all cases. Certainly, there's a lot of unwanted horses out there. But they're probably very thankful for the internal combustion engine, because they were treated very, very poorly specifically in the urban centers. So if we look at the general lifespan of a domesticated horse, which they all are, is somewhere between kind of 25 and 30 years on average. Urban horses in kind of the late 1800s, the average lifespan of an urban horse was 5 to 7 years, which is testament to how poorly they were treated and the conditions that they worked under, because they did everything for us in the mills, in the mines, in the streets, hauling omnibuses, hauling beer wagons, I mean, you name it, coal trucks, they did it all. So I think, in a way, it probably, and we don't use them in warfare anymore, obviously. Like 8 million horses died in the First World War. I mean, this is crazy numbers. So, although 10 million people died in the First World War too. So I think that they've been relegated to their rightful place, which is they eating in pastures in somebody's farm, and they get ridden once in a while and they get brushed. But that's not all I need to say. That's not all modern horses either. Some are treated horribly. I think I know they're not conscious beings, but what my book tries to do is give them the rightful place in history. And I guess that's the best thing, is we could acknowledge how much of a role, whether the causes are noble or nefarious, they played such a role in creating our modern world, good or bad, and that they deserve to be not necessarily credit, but acknowledged for their role in that.
Understood. This was my last question. Thank you for your time and for authoring this book. We've virtually touched every single topic that concerns humanity, and just through this horse, just through the horse. It's amazing.
Well, thank you.
Thanks again. I will
Yeah.
upload this conversation to YouTube today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.